take it away.
So, Will, you're going to start out reading a few pages for us. Is that right?
Yes, indeed.
Awesome.
I'm going to start at the beginning, which always seems like a good place to start. Not actually the preface, which is quite long, but the introduction. 2 days before he died, Lou Reed floated in the pale blue water of the heated saltwater swimming pool behind his East Hampton home. He was suffering, had been for a while. His liver, an organ he'd worked hard over the years, had all but ceased to function. After a waiting period, he'd finally received a transplant, but now that one was failing too. He knew these were his final hours, but he was with Laurie Anderson, his wife, partner, and soulmate, and a steady stream of close friends had been visiting to hang out, laugh, weep, eat, drink, and listen to music. On this afternoon, too weak to swim, Reed was being cradled in the arms of his friend Julian Schnabel. A decade apart in age, the two artists had risen to fame on parallel New York tracks. Both frequented Max's Kansas City. Both befriended Andy Warhol and shared his work ethic, making art as reflexively as breathing. In later years, they became close. Schnabel collaborated with Reed on a filmed staging of his Berlin LP in 2005, a record the painter and filmmaker loved. Reed was fiercely proud of the project, which was a vindication. When that album, the dark follow-up to his breakout Transformer and its radio hit Walk on the Wild Side, was first released in 1973, it was vilified by many. A Rolling Stone critic called it, quote, a disaster, and, quote, so patently offensive, the writer wanted to take, quote, physical vengeance on its maker. But time brought a critical reassessment, as it did again and again with Reed's work. Presenting Berlin in opera houses across Europe, its grim song cycle unspooled before magnificent hanging murals by Schnabel, the Berlin Wall, Reed dubbed it. The production turning, perhaps the greatest disappointment of Reed's career, into one of his greatest personal triumphs. Reed grew up in a seaside town on Long Island's South Shore. He knew the ocean well, invoked it in songs. Buoyed by the water, looking up at his large, hirsute friend, Reed recalled a moment as a child. You know, I was on the beach with my dad, Reed said, voice diminished to a hoarse whisper. I put my hand in his hand, and he smacked me in the face. The recollection, perhaps of a mid-century Jewish dad harshly instructing a son in the fraught matter of how to be a man in an anti-Semitic and homophobic culture, might have been accurate. It might also have been delusional hyperbole, born of Reed's failing health, and a lifetime of telling stories about himself that were not entirely true. His sister, for one, does not believe her brother's account. She never saw their father raise a hand to him, or anyone for that matter. Either way, Reed's friend thought it was a crazy thing. Here is a 71-year-old guy about to die, spending his final hours on Earth. And this is what he's thinking about. And I'll stop there. So, sorry, Gus.
Well, did you want to say something? I'm ready to start asking questions if you're ready to start answering them.
Sure. I mean, we can
Yeah,
just unspool the discussions of the archive
yeah, yeah,
in a volley. So,
yeah, yeah. I mean, I before we get into that, which is the I think focus today. Just we um we talked over the weekend, and I had yet to finish the book. And now that I finished it, I just have to say this book is such a gift. It's really one of the best, or quite possibly the best bio of a rock musician I've ever read. It's so impeccably researched. It's the Lou Reed Archive is just one part of that too. It's a significant part of it, to be sure, but the book is so incredibly fair and empathic, and without being hagiographic. And I just want to say, it's also just so thoughtful, for lack of a better word. I mean, I think that comes out in what you just read, but just the depictions of his relationships with people like Warhol and his partners, including Rachel Humphreys, the transgender woman who took the brunt of a terrible attack by Lester Bangs, and of course Laurie Anderson. It's just so smart in so many ways, both conceptual and just a sense of humanity and what people want and need from each other. It does all with such ease in its prose, and so I just wanted to gush a little bit at the beginning, just because I really found this such a phenomenal read. I also loved how the archive played a role in the end, and the very end is also just gorgeous writing, like we just heard. And we could obviously have like probably a couple dozen conversations, but yeah, we're gonna kind of base things, and just definitely start off talking about the archive, and this new Louis collection at the New York Public Library. Um, so I guess I just would just start out by asking you, what does that archive look like? What's in it? Is it like Warhol's, where you have like every receipt for every aspirin bottle he ever bought, or what are the sort of categories that make up the collection, or what is there a lot of, what is there not that much of?
well, I mean, first off, I just have to say thank you so much. I mean, you can't really see me like tearing up, but we all do, as writers and scholars, so much time alone working on something. And, you have a sense that it's worth doing because you're doing it. But like in terms of how it's going to come out, when it's going to come out, between the pandemic and health issues, there really were times where like I just didn't think I would get to the end of this project. So I mean, to hear your response to it, especially as somebody whose your book on Woody Guthrie, I felt really was going for a similar treatment of somebody who's so iconic and so mythic, and doing a really great, beautiful job of like humanizing him for good and for bad, as humans as humans tend to be. So anyway, thanks for the introduction. And as far as the archive goes, it was very different than the Warhol archive, which you kind of have to jump through hoops and be accepted to go into. I mean, the Lou Reed archive, you can actually go to the New York Public Library, and I'm holding up my Lou Reed library card, which you don't need to access this collection. You just need any library card. But for a while, they were promoting the acquisition of the collection by having Lou Reed library cards. And it's the special collections room. I believe it's the third floor. And once you have filled out a form and gained access to it, any New Yorker or even visitor can do that. You can call up boxes. There are 200 some boxes of documents, tchotchkes, photographs, letters, um, camera equipment, um, banners from the Mermaid Parade when Lou and Laurie were the king and queen, and Lola Bell was, I guess, I don't know, Princess Mermaid, their dog, and some of this, I mean, I by the time I got access to the archives, I'd been working on this book for well over 5 years. Um, I began it in late 2013. And I had no idea at first that there was going to be an archive made available. When I learned that from actually just somebody who worked for one of Lou Reed's labels, that like, oh yeah, he's got like all these storage lockers packed to the gills with all this stuff. And we're not really sure what's in it. We're not, we're thinking there are recordings. We might be doing some box sets, some like a Dylan bootleg series kind of series. But they just didn't know at the time, but they knew there was a lot of it, which anybody who's like lived the bulk of their life in Manhattan or any similar city, you're going to have lots of stuff in storage if you have lots of stuff, or you're very fortunate to like, have a building to hoard it in. Um, anyway, so there were 200 some boxes of things. They're divided up by the library system into various categories. But for my purposes, there were the recordings that are on the hard drive system in the library or cloud-based, whatever it is. You can't access it remotely. You have to go in to the library and sit down at one of their computers and get access to it. And there are bootleg recordings, many of which have been circulating all over the place on the internet for years. There were some recordings which hadn't been, like the real tape that Reed mailed himself in 1965 when he was working as a sort of songwriter for hire at Pickwick Records. He recorded a sort of demo with him and John Cale, addressed it to himself, mailed it to himself, and it was recently released by Light in the Attic Records as Lou Reed Words and Music 1965, if I'm remembering the name exactly. And so there was that kind of stuff. And you ask about Warhol's, whether that bared some similarity to Warhol's holdings in the museum. There was not as much, I don't want to call it junk, but there was not as much stuff. Warhol famously put together time capsules, which was basically like everything lying around his office. He'd just like sweep off his desk. Gus was telling me a story when we spoke the other day about like one box that had like an entire cake in it that had been there for decades. And because many of these boxes have never been opened up in the Warhol Museum. And Lou Reed didn't have any cake, although there was a can of Campbell's soup that was released as a promo item for the Songs for Drella record. And it was sort of like it had like the label mocked up as a Songs for Drella can of Campbell's soup, but it was clearly a real can of soup that over the years like had exploded, and then the contents had leaked out, and then it was all rusty, so like they had it Ziploc bag. So that was a useless item in terms of my research, but there were a lot of business documents. There was a lot of fan mail, folders and folders of fan mail, which was fascinating. And that was certainly very significant for my research for a couple of reasons, which I'll go into later. Photos of all sorts of things, because Lou Reed was a photographer himself and got kind of serious about his photography later in life, certainly after he met Laurie Anderson, who's, one of the greatest multimedia artists of, the last 50, 75 years. And I think she inspired him to like, double down on things that you're interested in that aren't music. Why not? You're an artist, do it. And so there were a lot of photos. There were faxes, smeary, crumbling faxes, for those of us in the audience who are old enough to remember them. I guess they're still, it's a medium that's still in use, but Reed was always an early adopter of new communication technologies. just like Warhol was with the cassette recorder. And Lou embraced faxes, and maybe to a fault. And so there were a lot of interesting faxes um, of his, including a flurry of communications around the time of the Velvet Underground's short-lived reunion in the 90s. Um, and yeah, there was that stuff, and I'm happy to go into like into detail on any of these categories um, that seem interesting to you, Gus, or seem worth riffing on.
Yeah, I mean, I would just, I would just ask you like what was the most or what were the most surprising one or two things you found in there?
Oh, single items. Certainly the tape of that 1965 demo was really striking to me. And the tape was released almost in full on that Light in the Attics release, but not completely in full. There were at least at least at least one or two songs that were not included, and there was a little bit of like finessing the song order. The demo tape did not begin with "Waiting for My Man," "Waiting for the Man." It began with a song that was really kind of like a folk revival style original about sung in the voice of a young woman. This is also on the album, but not first. Um, and it's Lou Reed basically singing in the character of a young woman who's not married and kind of scared of men because they're all really like kind of creeps. I'm doing a disservice to the lyrics in my paraphrase, but when I heard that, and just the whole tape, which is so steeped in folk revival style, um, I was shocked, especially early versions of Velvet songs, which because of reissues, I'd heard some folk treatments of Reed's early writing, but like you could see, like he was a musician and he was a writer, and he was looking to communicate certain things in his writing and lyrics, and the music could take any one of a number of forms. And when he was in college, he was into folk music. He was listening to Dylan. He went to see Joan Baez with his girlfriend, Shelley Albin, and that was surprising. And taken collectively, the fan mail was surprising. Maybe not um, the isness of it, but just the particularities of it. The absolute, and this is kind of what triggered this project, was seeing how intensely people were moved by his work, identified with various aspects of his work, um, and just just really took it to heart, like in the way that music can speak to fans in the most profound way. When he died, it was the first time I really registered a public mourning on social media. Back in 2013 was still, fairly new. Hashtags had just been introduced. So there was that aspect of it, but then there were also kind of creepy, stalkerish, um, very creepy pieces of fan mail, more than one, from multiple people. Um, and that was surprising because you just usually don't see that stuff. And even if you hear that, like, oh yes, this is something that people in the public eye have to deal with. Um, but it gave me a different understanding about Reed as somebody who could really be kind of a jerk to people in public settings, people he didn't know or people he sort of knew, um, because I certainly would have felt pretty unsafe if I was getting some of those letters.
Yeah, that I think brings up a question having to do with your own position, sort of as a fan, or your own emotional investment in this topic. I just I'd like to hear you talk about sort of like what it felt like to be um in there. Was it consistently exciting? Were there times when you were like, I wish I just hadn't seen that. Um and like you say, I mean, he had this reputation as kind of a nasty guy. It was very widespread. And my experience with Woody Guthrie, I definitely encountered some things that I was uncomfortable with. At the same time, you develop this intimacy with somebody, with your subject, and you love them in a way when you see so much of their life, and you almost kind of reflexively want to make them more sympathetic and explain their foibles, and sort of locate explanations for them. Did you find something like that happening? I guess I'm asking two questions, like one about feeling, if you want to talk about that, but also, did you find, more specifically, did you find something, that a kind of like reparative or like rehabilitative impulse happening um as you were working on the research?
Yeah, well, I mean, I can answer. I mean, both questions are really kind of connected. I mean, this kind of research, and from the Guthrie work, it's intimate. I mean, you're seeing stuff that, many people who knew the person well have never seen. Um, because, who has months to like sit down and go through somebody's belongings? Like normally, even if you're if somebody predeceases you and you're a partner and you've got to go through their belongings after they pass, at a certain point you might just start chucking stuff out wholesale because you just don't have the heart to go through it. But as a biographer, as a historian, you have Robert Caro and a million other folks in your ear, with their mandate to turn every page, and you just want to because you don't necessarily know what you're going to come across. And things aren't always filed correctly. I don't know if you found this at the Guthrie archives, but you might just find, whether it's a slip up from the archivist or just somebody who was replacing the documents when they were looking at them, things are just in the wrong place, and you're going through a file of what you think is just endless business documents, just days of business documents. There were probably more business documents in Reed's archive than anything else. So, just as an aside, to answer the question of like, were there times when you were like jumping out of your skin or bored or whatever? Yes, there were. Um, and but you never know, and because you never know what you're going to come across. And then also there's a kind of collective picture that emerges when you're looking at the pixels of um, music licensing agreements, um, many of which might have Lou's, as I learned, distinctive scrawl on them. Yes, no way, you know, this sucks, whatever it is. Um, and I learned collective from these collective documents how involved he was with the project of music licensing, how involved he was with the business end of being a musician, and how much he evidently enjoyed it, which I heard from his from colleagues and office folks. Well, on the face of it is maybe like the dullest part of researching a musician's life by some measures, but I found it pretty fascinating. Um, and also interesting insofar as his dad was an accountant, and Lou definitely saved his receipts. he was told to save his receipts, and he did. And I think I mentioned this the other day. Sometimes those were illuminating. It was like, him and Rachel going shopping in Japan, or getting a shopping trip in the East Village at a place. I think it was in the East Village. Maybe it was in the West Village, called Ian's. The place moved around a lot. Um, but Ian's was a clothing store that was kind of the proto-punk clothing store. It was run by a woman who used to work with Vivian Westwood in the early days, before punk broke, even broke mid 70s. And uh, and it was the receipt for the belt buckle that you see Lou Reed wearing above his crotch on the Rock and Roll Animal record. And I was like, oh wow, that's the belt buckle. Like $26 um, at Ian's. So yeah, there are things that you come across with that. But doubling back to the issue of, do you have an impulse to make them kinder, nicer? Uh, did you with Woody Guthrie a little bit?
I mean, yeah, I guess so. I don't think I'd be asking this question if I hadn't.
Yeah,
But I didn't feel like I was. I think it's more so, I think when you're so deep in an archive, you see a full gamut of emotions, experiences in a person's life, especially an archive that's as deep as I think both of these are, because I think one thing that our subjects have in common is that they both had literary aspirations. So there's a lot of text in both of them, beyond just like lyrics or whatever. Um, so you really see, um, a three-dimensional person, and so I guess it's more you come to have empathy for them. You come to understand more about I should be talking about my experience, but like I came to understand more about the reasons for why he did certain things, and how he suffered consequences for them as well. A lot of this having to do with his writing about sex and um, being
right.
arrested for obscenity charges because of that. But yeah, so it's more, maybe it's more that kind of a broad sense of empathy than love per se. But I don't know. How do you feel about that?
Yeah, I mean, I felt exactly the same way. I mean, and there's a consciousness that of that empathy developing, and it's correct that it develops, because I think writing a nuanced biography of someone is, if you can't see them as a human, if you can't empathize with them, then you're not gonna be able to get to the heart of the matter, I don't think. But I was very conscious of that. I mean, there's been a lot of nasty stuff written about Reed, and there's been kind of a reclamation project in the way he's looked at. There were not a lot of biographies of him when I started. There were, after the nearly 10 years it took me to get this book out, there are more. And some of them were, I don't want to dismiss any of the work, because almost all of it had value to me as a writer, as a biographer. But some of them went in like with a with not a very positive image of Reed, and so in a way, I was working against that, and just the natural impulse of hagiography that comes with writing a rock star bio of a white dude. Um, so I just checked myself, and spoke to as many people as I could who knew him. And because he died in his early 70s, there were a lot of people who knew him well. And you have to vet people and figure out how much you believe their stories, what their agenda is, whether they have access to grind or not. whether they're trying to improve one part of his life story in terms of how he comes off or not. But when it's all totaled, I think that I definitely was more more favorably disposed to certain periods in his life and certain things that he did. If I didn't, I tried to not excuse any of his bad behavior, but I understood it better and just tried to present the facts of what I found and kind of let people decide, what their take on it is.
That was certainly my experience of reading the book. I felt that way for sure. I wanted to sort of change up a little bit the focus, although I think there's still room for us to talk about the archive in this regard. But I just wanted to talk about the extent to which you focus on queerness and the fundamental part of him that was queer. To the extent that you end up wondering, one ends up wondering, I think, why there was ever any ambiguity around this issue. I think some people have this sense that Reed was sort of like queer when he was around the factory crowd, and then he got straight and like occasionally would like, flirt with it or like use it as a kind of publicity tool. Because I mean, like I grew up hearing his music being played next to Leonard Skinner, on FM radio and all that sort of thing. But
Queer
that's,
icons, Leonard Skinner, the
I mean,
queer
yeah,
icons.
obviously, like
Yes.
that only increased his cachet for me. But no, but yeah, reading your book, you realize that's so not true. There are so many instances of him even using the word gay to describe himself or describe his work, like shouting out gay activists in the early 70s. And then again, probably, it's notable that during the AIDS crisis, at one point you mentioned him telling an interviewer something like, "It's just that my gay people don't lisp," which I thought was a really interesting line. But this is again like a really huge highlight of the book as we kind of watch him move through various, basically through the late 20th century history of queer sexuality, and come up hard against the epidemic, with a ton of loss in his life. So I guess one thing I'm curious about is, do you think the archive made his queerness more sort of palpable, or was your kind of centering the book around that? Was that sort of more your overall approach in advance of the archive?
It was definitely in advance of the archive. Like one of the things that fascinated me and appealed to me about Reed's music was like the queer sensibility of his work, of the early Velvet's work, of his solo work, really kind of all the way through, if not always explicitly. But I certainly heard it loud and clear, and other people did too. And there were times in his life, as you said, and this was early on for the most part, when he used the word gay on occasion to describe his own sexual identity, but he didn't talk about it a lot. And the fact of the era that he was coming up in, there were times when he was with in a queer friendly community. Certainly the factory was that. And there were other times when not so much, as when he was in like, the heavy metal rock world in the 70s, where despite the kind of the queerness of the Transformer record and you know Bowie and he, being these kind of like, at the time, I guess, bisexual was the term in vogue, was that somehow was just sort of not dealt with. Journalists either didn't want to go there, or Reed didn't want to go there if journalists raised those questions. And I think Reed was very selective when he was talking to people. Like, if you got it, if he felt safe, um, you'd get an entirely different interview than if he sensed, if he felt unsafe or felt that you just weren't going to get it. So there were, certain interviews that he talked about queerness. One great interview in the late 70s was in Cream, of all places, when he just talked about, you know, being gay, that he was a gay artist, and how can anybody who's gay not be crazy in the culture that we live in. And when I compared the the date of the interview, not the publication date, but the date that the interview was done, with some newspaper events, it was clear that he was speaking only days after Harvey Milk was shot. And that would have been on the front page, I believe, of the New York Times. So those are the kind of things you discover, and you're like, okay, I kind of see why he might be talking this way at this moment in time. And this was at a time when he had just, I think, had recently split with Rachel and had begun a relationship. Rachel, his trans partner of about 3 years, and begun a relationship with Sylvia Morales, later Sylvia Reed, who was his second wife. So now we look at these things as like, oh, okay, well, you're queer, and sometimes some of your relationships are same sex, and some of them aren't. But I think a lot of people who, as you said, who would discuss Reed, they would either think like, oh, he's always making up lies about himself. He was just performing. He was just pretending to be queer to get in with the factory crowd. And but from the people that I spoke with, that just seemed to not be the case. This was just somebody who had a fluid sexuality, the same way that people have had through all of time, but that only in recent years have we really learned how to talk about that. And I'm still not sure that, most cultures are all that comfortable with it. I mean, to be bisexual or queer is like, oh, you're just greedy, you're just indecisive, you know. So I could get why Reed didn't want to get into that with like your average rock journalist. Like that seemed like totally understandable to me. And it just felt like this project, one of the things that was pushing me to do it was wanting to fill that out, especially with like the culture war that's continuing to go on against queer folk and trans folk in particular in this country. So it just felt timely as a framing,
Yeah.
or a recentering, I think,
Yeah.
which is the term I'd like to use.
Yeah, it's very powerful at this particular moment. I guess just one more question on that, and then maybe we'll throw things open. I was curious whether you talk a little bit about this, but I guess I wanted to ask you to expand on it. How much talking about the fan mail, like what sense you got of a queer constituency, and how, what kind of language was used, if there, to the extent that there was one, what kinds of stories got told in those fan letters around this issue? Because it must, I mean, as you say, lots of us have known for a long time that he was queer, and he was, an important queer person in the world and a queer cultural producer. So I'd like to hear a little bit about how fans like through the years were engaging him on that.
Yeah, and some of the letters said this specifically. There's one in particular that I think I quote, which might have been from somebody, a trans person in Australia, who said something to the effect of, if I hadn't discovered your music, I'd probably be dead now. And boy, you sitting in a special collections room, over air conditioned. Like even just saying that, like I still feel the chill that went up my spine. And there are there were a lot of long letters, and there were a lot of very literate letters. Like you would imagine that Lou Reed had a literate fan base. Like letters would be like 4 or 5 handwritten pages. Um, and very often they didn't specify sexuality, but they just talked about people identifying with his songs, and identifying with you know um, various various albums like Magic and Loss, which was an album about death, very moving, came out after the New York album, and which was about the death of Doc Pomus, publicly, in terms of how Reed talked about it in interviews. But I think it was also about Rachel Humphreys, who passed around that time. And even though Reed did not talk about it, and I think that when he passed, there was a quote that Michael Stipe gave, calling him the first queer icon of the 21st century, 30 years before it actually began. And that was a quote that just always rang in my ears, not just because I'm a massive REM fan, and REM's covers of the Velvet Underground's work in college really like kind of lit the fuse for my Velvet Underground fandom. But also just because it just rang true. I think anybody who's you know eh, thinking about their own sexuality and just wondering what they you know how they identify, the mystery that sexuality can be, especially when you're an adolescent and in college. And I think Reed spoke to that really clearly, and not always that explicitly.
All right, thank you. Why don't we look at what's been going on in the chat? Francesca, you're gonna oversee this.
Yeah, there's some really great questions. So let's jump in. The first question is from Dana Poland.
Hi. Great. This is a great presentation. I wanted to ask a question. I've always wanted to ask of anyone who writes a biography, and since we have 2 biographers here, and it's a kind of naive question, but and maybe it's also because I've always thought about writing a biography, probably never will, and I don't know who I would write it about. But how does a biographer know if anyone else is working on the same subject, or do you ignore that? Does your literary agent know that? Do you find it when you go to some archive and they say someone else was here yesterday and looked at the same files? I mean, it would be my worst nightmare to spend a long time on a biography and then have someone else discover someone else was doing that. So how do you know, or like I said, do you not care?
Oh, you care. Sometimes. I mean, it depends.
But is there a way you know?
Yeah, well, I heard my own personal experience, and I'm sure everybody's is different, is you just hear through the grapevine. You might hear it from your editor, you might hear it from a friend. I mean, I've been a journalist for many years, so, I heard that there was another book coming, and then another biography coming, and then there was one in the works, by by Lucy Sant, which Lucy ultimately decided not to do, and kind of reoriented her writing projects going forward. But that was kind of a relief. I'm being totally honest here, just as Lucy being one of the great cultural critics, and there were times when I was just like, maybe I should just bow out of this horse race, but it's not a horse race. That's the thing that I just kept coming back to. How many good books are there on Dylan? How many good books are there on, I don't know. I mean, any artist of high accomplishment. Different books do different things. So I just doubled down and did the work and figured that what I came up with would be the book that I wanted to write. And you know, actually coming in last, I think helped because it made available other things that that the writers who came earlier didn't have access to. Todd Haynes's great Velvet Underground documentary, and of course the archives.
I mean, I would just, my experience of that is learning through the archivist what's going on, who else has been coming through town.
Right.
And then, I think when it is just one figure, so yeah, it's easy to learn that stuff. And even to sometimes meet these people, which I did do with a guy named Will Kaufman, who's written like 3 or 4 really, really good books about Woody Guthrie. But through meeting him, I realized that my book was going to be really different from what he was doing. I mean, my book is a little weird, and it's more about Guthrie's later life. That's not really part of the boxcar days myth, etc. And it ended up that we were actually able to sort of help each other in some ways. I think also, again, like these figures that have these really deep archives, there's just like, there's so many, it's more like writing a biography of like a canonical literary figure or something. There's just so many different directions you can go with them.
Right.
It's a great question. I love that question.
Yeah. And because I mean, how many totally unique ideas are there? Like how many, I mean, sure, you can find a topic that nobody has written on, but I didn't find out about Anthony de Curtis's biography until we were both underway, and I thought he wrote a very good book. There was a book published just recently called My Tai Chi, a book, kind of an oral history of Lou Reed's interest in martial arts, that Laurie Anderson and a number of Lou's fellow Tai Chi practitioners put together. And that in and of itself is a great Lou Reed biography, but it takes a particular angle. So yeah, there's room on the shelf.
Okay, Courtney Smith, you had a good question to ask.
I will.
Hey, Courtney.
Hi. So I am so interested that all these business documents were in the archives, because that is the thing artists tend to be the least transparent about, either because they are not very involved in the business, or, those maneuvers, they don't really want to be seen as having their hands on them. And I already knew about Lou's very hands-on strategy with licensing, especially through doing some licensing work. But I'm curious what else might have popped out to you. What other sort of secrets or things that we didn't know about Lou might be hidden in those documents?
Well, though in those documents in particular, it was really just his in a way his artistic sensibility, because Lou Reed didn't sell a whole lot of records. He was not a massive artist. Like, I remember there was one period in time that during my research, I realized that like David Bowie had sold out 3 nights at Madison Square Garden. And like a week later, Lou Reed had sold out 3 nights at the Bottom Line, which is like walking distance from Madison Square Garden if you know New York City. But I mean, literally it held like a few hundred people as opposed to 20,000 people. So that, even though history has kind of put them on a similar level, on a practical level, they were not at all, earning out in the same way. And Lou, and credit should go to Sylvia Reed, because Sylvia was kind of his business manager, or at least his kind of when he did have a manager other than Sylvia, she was, she kept an eye on things. You could see like her handwriting was on all these documents. But you would see like Lou, when it came to Walk on the Wild Side, he'd be asking top dollar for ad usage, for film usage most of the time. But if it was like a not-for-profit documentary, if it was something that, he wanted to support, a student film, he'd give it to they'd give it to somebody for like $75 or for free. And I thought that was great. There were some usages which he just denied outright, on TV shows that he didn't like. I don't want to I don't want to impugn any particular TV shows, but he called them as he saw them, and he also it resulted in, actually, whether or not you think ads can be art. I mean, Warhol certainly did. I mean, because Warhol started, doing, he started his career as an ad man. And then once he became a famous fine artist, he began doing ads for like Schrafft's ice cream. It was a way to bring in money. And in a way, it was a way to free yourself to make music, in Reed's case, that didn't get on the radio, that didn't sell a whole lot of copies. But if you were getting paid six figures for Walk on the Wild Side in some champagne ad in Europe, then you had a little bit more freedom to make less commercial pop music, I guess. So yeah, I think the most revealing things about him personally, though, you saw there were not a lot of letters written by him, and I'm not sure, and Gus can talk about this as well, I'm sure, whether things were all put in the archive or whether things were selectively put in the archive with some things held back. There were not a lot of letters written by Reed, but there were some faxes, certainly around the time of the Velvet Underground breaking up, that were unnerving. There's one that I quote in the book in particular that was written to Mo Tucker, and it was just really nasty. And Mo Tucker, who was a super close friend of Reed's and remained a close friend even after this fax that I guess was sent. I'm not even sure. It can't be 100% sure that it was sent, but it looked like it was. It was just, they were fighting. They were a band, they were a family, they were fighting, and it was not nice.
Well, that actually makes me want to ask you one more question. Did your sense of the band, based on what was in the archive, make you feel like it was a family rather than a business? Like we think of the Rolling Stones as a business, whereas the Velvet Underground maybe wasn't that.
Well, I don't know. I think it was both. It was an unsuccessful business in a lot of ways first time around. Great as those records were, they were commercial failures by most measures. And when they got back together in the 90s, I think it was definitely a business for everybody. Like, that Lou might not have really needed the money as much as other members of the band did, but everybody was interested in making money. But it was hard. There was a lot of water under the bridge, and his tension with John Cale, who he fired or had fired by Sterling, who had to deliver the news back in 1968, and he, it was tough for them to work together, and Sterling and Mo did their best to kind of help hold things together, but yeah, so it was a business. They did okay, but it fell apart before they made as much money as they could, and that, I think, was disappointing to maybe not Lou, but certainly to the other members of the band. My personal my personal regret is that there was never a Velvet Underground Unplugged, which was an MTV project that was discussed quite seriously. There were faxes back and forth about, is the MTV Unplugged? Like, if they could have just held it together to do that, I think it might have been a better memory than some of the live recordings, the shows they did. But c'est la vie.
The next question was mine, and you may have actually answered it already in your conversation with Gus, but I'm just enjoying this so much. But my question was really also about like the current zeitgeist and how you see the book's timeliness. And you mentioned, and you were talking a lot about queer culture. If there's any other aspects of that that you'd like to talk about, like especially thinking about New York. I know that's your beat.
Well, I mean, Lou lived for many years on Christopher Street. Like, come on. This is like the center of, at one time, New York City gay culture in Lower Manhattan on the West Side. And I was very interested in Rachel Humphreys, his trans partner, and I think a lot of people were, because Rachel was mysterious. Rachel was seen publicly with Reed on many occasions. There were beautiful photos shot by Mick Rock of the two of them. She appeared on album covers. She was, a partner, a muse, a subject who appeared in many of his songs, either by name or under aliases, as Lou often would write songs that you would later learn were about a particular person, but he changed the name to protect the innocent. So it felt important to me, like, trans stories have gotten erased for ever. And I just wanted to see if I could tell that story. Rachel had passed in the 90s, it turned out. And I did what I could. Some people connected me with relatives of Rachel's, and I spent some time with them in a sibling's living room, going through old photos, which was tremendously moving. And some of that I used in the book. Some of it I didn't, because it just, that's a whole other thing that you can get into in terms of things that people share with you, and either on the record or off the record or in some sort of a gray area, where as a biographer, you have to sort of make a decision of, you've then given, there's a trust when somebody tells you their story, and you want to honor that trust. And so, I felt like I was able to tell Rachel's story as fully as anyone had. And I thought that was an important part of the book's project. So, and I also learned how much of trans history and queer history, and you know this, Francesca, from your work, just continues to be expanded upon by scholars. And the material that was available when I started the book was different than what I wound up being able to access towards the end of the book. So you're constantly like standing on the shoulders of other scholars who do great work, which allows you to move forward. And I'll just say the last thing, one thing in particular, the Randall's Island project, or the Hart's Island project, which was the New York Times was very involved in it, and which sought to identify the many people who died of HIV/AIDS in the early years of the epidemic, and were buried in unmarked graves on Hart's Island, tracing them and putting name to location. And from that, and that story ran in the Times very near the end of my writing process. Rachel was identified as one of the people who was buried there early on. So that was kind of a poignant grace note towards the end of my research about that that one particular story in the book.
Wow, that's really powerful. And thank you, Will. Okay, let's see. Barry. Barry has a question.
Yeah, I was curious I was curious about the context of the archive itself.
Barry, we're having a little bit of trouble, or is anybody else having trouble hearing you?
Yeah, there's an audio issue, Barry. I couldn't quite hear you. Yeah, I'm getting sound, but it's very, very faint.
Question is whether you got to think of the context of the archive. Whether you or anybody else edited it, raced over it, changed what was in or out of it.
Francesca, do you want to
Yeah,
just read the question?
I can also, I think he was asking about Reed's control over an editing of the archive. Is that right?
Yeah, to the best of my knowledge, Reed was not involved in the editing of the archive. When he was alive, and Laurie Anderson and he were talking about kind of creating a performance space, archival space, maybe in Red Hook in Brooklyn. I mean, they talked about it, but it was never. I think it was going to be called like the Lou and Laurie Ranch or something. I forget the name of it. And Schnabel was going to be involved, and it would be a place for them to like put all of their stuff, all of their archives. I mean, Laurie Anderson has an incredible archival collection of a lifetime's worth of art making, installation pieces, all sorts of things. And that was something that was never realized. And so I think Lou passed with just all this stuff in boxes, and I don't think he even knew what was there and what wasn't. But in undertaking the establishment of the archives, Laurie Anderson and along with Don Fleming, who's a musician and an archivist who is very involved, took a lead with the Lou Archives, and Jason Stern, who was working with him, part of Sister Ray Enterprises. They went through the archive material before it went into the archive. What they left in and took out, I don't really know, but they were the ones who went through it, I would say, Jason and Don and Laurie.
Excellent. And I think Jerry's question was also about that. Jerry, does that satisfy your question?
Yes. Yeah, I was just curious exactly who turned all this information over. I think he just answered that just now. Thank you.
Yeah, and I will say this, and this is something I've learned, and maybe this is not news for a lot of you all, but what's listed on the boxes, what's listed on the files, what's listed in the digital listing on the library's website is not always an exact indication of what's in those boxes. I mean, again, sometimes things are misfiled. Sometimes if you hang around in an archive long enough, maybe an archivist will slip you something that's not, that hasn't been archived yet, or might not otherwise turn up in the collection. So just as researcher to researchers, there's nothing that replaces going to sit in the archives, going through the boxes, spending the time, getting to know the archivists as much as you can. Because in addition to those folks who prepared the archives for the New York Public Library. There were the New York Public Library archivists and librarians who run the special collections room, who run the recording wing, who went through all this stuff. And I'm sure they had a say as well in what was held, how it was preserved, how it was presented, how it was listed.
Terrific. Carl has an excellent question about interviewing.
Hey, thanks. This has been great. So yeah, my question is also about research, but not about archives. On the theme of writing a biography about a sometimes difficult person, which is something I'm also in the process of trying to do. Were people reluctant or guarded in talking about their more painful interactions with Lou? And how did you approach those questions and conversations and finding ways to get them to open up about things that they might not prefer to talk about? Or were there things that you decided to leave alone for the purposes of cultivating relationships with interviewees and all of that kind of thing? I'd love to hear you talk about that.
Well, the short answer to the first part of your question was yes, there was definitely a lot of reluctance at the outset. Part of it was because there were so many biographers who had been reaching out to the archive, A. B, Reed was famously not into biographers. He tried to block Victor Bockras's biography back in the 90s by sending letters to friends telling them not to cooperate, and colleagues. And, I think maybe there were some legal maneuverings as well. So, and because, certainly as I went on, there were books written about Reed that were not flattering. And so that makes your job harder as a biographer, because people are like, oh, here's another asshole, excuse my language. So you kind of have to get past that. Sometimes you do, sometimes you don't. Some people did not want to talk. Other people did not want to talk at first. And then over time, you get vetted by one person or another person, and then maybe the person comes around, or maybe they don't. Or maybe somebody gives you an interview that is incredibly guarded. And you talk to other people and you get different versions of the story that maybe that first person told you. And you go back to them and say, hey, would you mind talking to me again? And then sometimes they'll open up a lot more. You really formed like these relationships. It was incredibly moving. Like, going back to Gus's question about, do you feel empathy for a person? Do you kind of fall in love with them in a way? I mean, you also kind of become a family member. I mean, you're talking to everybody in the person's family who's willing to talk to you about this person, and you want to know everything. So that's also an intimate act. And, there are times when somebody will say, well, this is off the record, please don't write this, but and as a biographer and as a human being, like, then you have a choice, either like, don't tell me because it's not going to be off the record, or tell me and I promise that I will not write it. And my strategy with that is like, keep to your word. If you say you will hear something off the record, make sure it stays off the record. And but for me, it was useful to get as much information as I can, and just for the overall picture. And very often people, as I said earlier, people would give you information you had to sort of decide, because maybe they weren't specific about whether they gave you a green light or a red light for a particular thing. But you ask yourself, well, if this might hurt somebody, especially somebody who's not in the public eye, somebody who is not a famous person, except by virtue of maybe their proximity to this famous person you're writing about, um, is if this is going to like make their lives more difficult, is this something that's necessary for the story? And how do you weigh that? And virtually every time, like I would, maybe this makes me not a less of a biographer, but I hope it makes me a better human, that I would always decide in favor of like not making somebody's life difficult by some information, which, I mean, in the end, whatever, not necessary in the big picture.
Well, we have a couple of more questions. Do you think you can go a little bit more?
Yeah, sure.
Yeah.
Yeah,
You're doing
sure.
good?
Let's go for
Okay.
it. Yeah,
Okay,
running
that
on
was
fumes
great.
a little bit, but hey,
Oh,
if I start being indecipherable, then just cut me off.
okay. You're great. You're doing great. Okay, Karen Rose has a question for you.
Oh, Karen.
Hey there.
Hey, Karen. How you doing?
Doing okay. Thanks for doing this. My question was, did you have any idea of what you thought you would find? Like, did you hear through the grapevine that this is rumored to be in the archive and you should look for it and it wasn't there? Or I wrote my question because now I'm blanking. Or did you have or did you just have this sort of sense of, I would love it if these lyrics were there, or the first the first, did that make sense when
Yeah. Yeah, no, it makes perfect sense. And I I didn't know anything initially. I knew that there were a bunch of recordings, but I also knew that there have been decades of obsessive Velvet Underground scholars and tape traders who, have been trading everything that they could get their hands on. So I hope that there would be stuff that I didn't come across, but I wasn't holding my breath. There were some things, but Velvet Underground material, not really. In fact, most of the material really dated to the 80s and later. There was not that much on from the Velvets era and from the early and from the 70s. There was stuff, but just not a lot. And I have to say that that as valuable as the archives were, some of my favorite things that I came across, and what felt like the most important um, for telling the story, were things that I came across elsewhere, not in the archives. Some stuff that I found in the Harry Ransom Center, which was actually Victor Bakris dumped a bunch of stuff that he used for his biography, but he didn't use all of this stuff. And that was pretty interesting. The Warhol Museum, which the scholar at Cornell University, Judith Pereno, discovered this tape that Lou made, sketching out some a musical idea for a musical version of Warhol's autobiography that Andy Warhol from A to B, I think was the name of it, in the mid '70s. And that hearing that, and also hearing just some conversations of like Lou going out with Andy and talking about whatever, just over dinner at Reno Sweeney's, and then heading out to the Ninth Circle, which is a famous gay bar, kind of cruising joint in the West Village. That was not in the archive. So there was, if your subject doesn't have like a big famous archive at the New York Public Library, that's okay, because you get stuff from all over. I also was introduced to some people who knew Reed just from being a lifelong New Yorker and journalist. and things that were given to me that were outside of the archival purview. So you get it where you can.
And just piggybacking, this is just a fun question. Was there anything when I was working on the Patti Smith book? I was very excited to go look at this notebook that was supposed to be like Patti Smith, Richard Hell notebook. And I got there and it was a book. It was a notebook that Patti had kept a diary in for like 4 pages. And then because it was a very good notebook, she gave it to her friend, Richard Hell, to use, because why would you throw out a very good notebook? And then I found I had to read the whole thing just in case. So there was a lot of complaining about Johnny Thunders, which was fascinating, but not at all germane to what I was working on. Anyway, thank you. Thank you for doing this. And congratulations on getting it done and having your book. And I put this in the chat. Doesn't matter how many books there are, it's your book. So congrats on that.
Yes, thank you, Karen. Thanks.
Okay, let's wrap up with Barclay's question or questions.
Hi, I'm a big fan of Love Goes to Buildings on Fire, very inspirational for my own work. And I love that it was a biography of the entire city, really, and with some of your own biography in there. And I've yet to read the Lou Reed book, but I read one interview you wrote where you said you wanted to use the biography as a lens to talk about, I just realized something, as a lens to talk about so many other things, which is really my favorite kind of book. Like you think you're reading a book about this person, but really you're reading a socio-political history of something else. So you mentioned earlier, obviously queer culture, trans history would be one of those things you wanted to illuminate through the lens of Lou Reed, but what are the others?
Well, what made the project interesting, and this is what I've always seen music writing as a vehicle for, which is everything. I mean, I grew up reading The Village Voice when people would write like 3,000 words about an album and not even get to the album until you're 1,000 words in, because it was a way to tie in life to art. And the more I learned about Reed's life, when it was the idea to do a biography came up, which I wasn't necessarily sure I ever wanted to write a biography, I saw that, wow, I mean, this is a way to look at literally the entire post-war, not the entire, but segments of the post-war arts world in New York City because of the scenes he was involved with. He studied with Delmore Schwartz, so the New York scene poets that Delmore sort of predated in a way. That was something Reed, really kind of came right out of, and then landed in the Factory, which was, both the visual arts and early multimedia arts scene, and the experimental film scene that Warhol was kind of piggybacking off of. It was a chance to tell a little bit, and I just didn't have room to go that deep into the stories of Jonas Mekas and about Barbara Rubin, who was such an incredible figure. Certainly, she is the subject of a documentary recently, and I don't know if there's a biography about Barbara Rubin, but there should be. And then going on through the era that I write about in Love Goes, and later when Reed connected with Laurie Anderson and intersected with the broader experimental art world in Manhattan. So it was a chance to write about all these things, and Reed as a queer man, seeing how queer politics evolved in New York, which is one of the epicenters of AIDS, and certainly of queer activism with Stonewall. And Reed literally lived upstairs from the Stonewall bar for the years. I'm pretty sure it was only the years that it had become a deli. It was closed and then became a deli, before that the deli closed and then it was reopened as a bar. But all of those New York stories were really exciting to research. So it was, having a single person as a through line, as opposed to all these other figures in Love Goes that were sort of woven through, was a different way to do the same thing in a way.
I'm also just kind of amazed that Laurie Anderson and Lou Reed didn't intersect earlier, for all, like, especially after reading Love Goes Buildings on Fire. And I love the story about how she thought he was British, because she thought the VU were British, which is frankly incredulous, but that is the story.
I know that is the story, and there are a lot of storytellers in the story that I'm telling, so that we work with the narratives that are out there, and it's fascinating. But New York's a big little town, so things can be happening one block over, and you might not necessarily know about them.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Well, thanks so much, Will and Gus, for this really amazing conversation. So terrific. And also wanting to thank all of you for coming. Next week, on Tuesday, November 14th, Langston Colin Wilkins is going to be talking about Houston hip hop. So please pop back in again at 5 p.m. and we'll be sending out more information soon on that.
Excellent.
Have a great night.
We'll get chopped and